Ladies and gentlemen, this is a warning. Thank you.
Without a doubt, the letters BTK will forever be synonymous with a serial killer in Wichita. Dennis Rader would confess and be convicted of 10 counts of murder between 1974 and 1991. But with his capture, police and citizens were wondering if he had committed more crimes. While researching that case, I would discover a number of other crimes in Wichita that bore some similarities with BTK's method of murder. But far more intriguing was the differences between those and the similarities amongst themselves. Dennis Rader had a clear method, as he would famously state in his own moniker. He would break in, bind his victims, suffocate them, and then sexually gratify himself over their corpse.
Yes, I had some sexual fantasies, but that was after she was home.
He would carry a gun and knife, but only use them in one known instance when the situation got out of his control. However, a number of other women in Wichita would be found killed in two similar yet different murder methods throughout the 70s to 90s. One group would be tied and viciously stabbed or strangled, while another group would be killed by a blow to the head with an unknown weapon. While many of these deaths would be looked at as related to BTK, no links would be found to the killer, who would typically take souvenirs and Polaroids of his victims. This begs the question: did Wichita have one or more other serial killers?
Goes on in San Francisco for the man known as the Zodiac Killer.
There could be a serial killer in Chicago.
The Oakland County child killer.
Phantom Killer.
Frankfurt slasher.
4 children have now been murdered.
Has killed 5 and says he's going to kill again.
15 brutally murdered young women.
The pattern is the same.
One by one, the death count started rising.
A man in a mask robbed, tied, and stabbed them.
Strangled, stuffed in burlap bags.
It is highly unlikely that these women were murdered by separate men.
Where will the killer strike next?
Police can't answer who or why.
That's the question that we'll never know.
I don't want to live the rest of my life wondering if this person's going to be caught.
I believe that there's someone out there that has knowledge.
And he's probably still at large.
This vacant lot a bit northeast of Wichita's Old Town district is where 23-year-old Sherry Baker lived in an apartment. It was just 7 months after BTK's second murder of Catherine Bright when the Wichita State University student's mother came over to the house and spotted her daughter's body on the living room floor. A screen and a side window was found to have been torn, and the window appeared pried open. Fingerprints were noted as being collected. Sherry's attacker had used her phone cord to wrap her hands behind her back and then place the phone back on the receiver. They either used her panties or a piece of towel to gag her and then used the rest of the towel to tie a knot around her throat before stabbing her over 70 times with a pair of scissors until one of the blades broke off inside her. Finally, they grabbed a butcher knife and slit the woman's throat, leaving the weapon beside her. The killer finally washed their hands in the sink and rummaged through several rooms before leaving. Police would quickly question Sherry's boyfriend, whom she had reported him assaulting her multiple times. Another time, she was hospitalized for an assault, but would not name her attacker in that instance. Sherry also had a child who lived with other relatives, but was not reported who the father was. The boyfriend and several others were all released after questioning. A few days later, police announced they were still trying to locate a second boyfriend of the woman's who was seen with her that weekend of her murder. But this would be the end of articles on that crime. In 1978, BTK would send a letter to the news claiming the Otero family, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, and an unnamed seventh victim, challenging police to figure out who it was. They would settle on Catherine Bright as the most likely suspect, but Sherry Baker was also considered a possibility. After his eighth intended victim failed to return home in 1979, BTK would seemingly not strike again for 7 more years. But 1 year later, another murder occurred that would be the first in a series of women who died from blows to the back of their head. It was October 25, 1980, when 37-year-old Barbara Smith's ex-husband came to her home at 1151 South Waverly to bring back their daughter after spending the previous night in Oklahoma on a trip. At some point between 8 and 24 hours prior, someone had attempted to strangle Barbara, but upon failing, beat her to death on the spiral staircase leading to the den the Smiths had built above their garage. At first, it was believed she had been shot, but an autopsy would show the beating was so severe her skull had been fractured twice. Her killer had then tried to set 2 small fires in the room below the body, but neither had caught. It was January 9th, 1982, when the partially clad body of 48-year-old Gloria McCulloch was found lying in a car parked in a small lot on the northeast corner of 9th and Meade, an industrial area just off St. Francis Hospital. The coroner's report stated she had died from a fractured skull, but that exposure had also factored into her death. Gloria was a drifter who had just begun living in Wichita after she came into the home of Besley Noble for a party and decided to stay. In the short amount of time Gloria had come to Wichita, she had quickly become known around the area as a partier on 9th Street. "11 months later, a woman with a very similar background would be killed. It was December 14th, 1982, when a city worker driving along a service road at what was now the K-96 fishing pond spotted a body lying in a field just off the road. A sketch of the woman was broadcast on television, and the sister of Daisy Hamilton Cole called in. Also known as Cookie, the 34-year-old divorced woman was a known drifter who hitchhiked with men to get to local bars. Initial reports stated that multiple shotgun blasts had killed her, including one to the head, but on Wichita's cold case website currently, it simply states she died from apparent head trauma. The next murder would occur 2 months after BTK struck again, although the public nor police knew he was back. On June 29, 1985, 31-year-old Linda Shawn Casey's boyfriend would enter her apartment in a home at the corner of what was then North Spruce Street and 3rd Street. Since then, 3rd Street has been torn up for a drainage ditch, but the small home would have sat just about here. Earlier that day, 2 friends had come by to see if Linda was able to get some Tom Petty concert tickets that she had spoken to them just hours earlier about, but no one answered the door. They noticed that a window Linda normally kept open for plants was closed and covered. 3 hours after they gave up and left, her boyfriend entered to find the WSU student's body lying on her bedroom floor. After tying and gagging her, her killer sexually assaulted her, smashed a wine bottle over her head, and stabbed her repeatedly in the back, stomach, and groin before slitting her throat and leaving the knife beside the body. There were no signs of a forced injury, and her telephone line was cut. The killer had washed up in the sink, unaware that it was broken and would cause water to leak into the basement apartment, whose occupants started banging on the ceiling. Before leaving, he would switch into a pair of pants of Linda's boyfriend's that were hanging and take his bloody clothes with him. It was 11 p.m. on Halloween night 1987 when 15-year-old Shannon Olsen left her friend's home on the 1000 block of South Hydraulic Avenue to go get something to drink. Coincidentally, this is directly across the road from the former Dillon's supermarket where BTK parked when he committed his 3rd attack on Shirley Vian a decade prior. The next afternoon, 2 men coming to the K-96 fishing park would find a grisly sight. 5 feet from the shoreline on the north side of the peninsula was the nude body of Shannon.
She had been stabbed several times in the chest and her throat had been slashed. Her hands were tied behind her back.
Her hands had been tied behind her back with her bra. Then she was stabbed 40 times in the neck and chest before her throat was slashed.
Only police investigators were allowed near the water's edge. What they found was the grisly aftermath of a bloody murder. A woman's nude body about 5 feet offshore. The murderer bound her hands behind her back and slit her throat. 2 frightened fishermen discovered the body first.
We just went fishing and we seen this and we freaked out and ran, called the police.
Our lab people are processing the immediate scene and we'll be working on the case trying to identify this individual.
Rumors that Shannon had a pentagram tattoo on her ankle developed into her involvement in the occult. The high school sophomore was described as a partier who would disappear from home for days at a time. Her friends stated she had been involved in a satanic cult. She was known to have a pentagram tattoo on her ankle, though her father said she had got it with a group of friends a while back, but it meant nothing. Of 50 students and teachers interviewed, no one could identify a single cult member, but everyone knew of 2 sophomore girls that they all referred to as the witches. They wore white makeup, black clothes, and hissed at people. The 2 girls gave candid interviews to the Wichita Eagle, laughing that they were really just making a fashion statement. They too wondered if Shannon was involved with a cult. But this was the era of satanic panic, and Shannon's case would be recalled over the following year when a piece on Satanism in the city was released. Another tangent involves none other than the Zodiac Killer. On October 28, 1987, someone claiming to be the Zodiac mailed a letter to the Vallejo Times in California, claiming to have a plan to go out on Halloween night in his death machine looking for kitties to run over. It was October 2nd, 1989, when a man coming to check on 20-year-old Christa Martin discovered her lying on her couch inside her apartment at 506 East Osage. Someone had killed her with a single blow to the back of the head with a blunt object. The weekend prior, police responded to an assault call to the home after 2 men were seen leaving the home after screaming was heard, but Christa did not identify whoever had hit her. No signs of burglary or sexual assault were present. 2 weeks later, an ad was run in the Wichita newspaper directed at her killer. It was just before midnight on Saturday, August 14, 1993, when 25-year-old Christy Hatfield left her home on the 2100 block of South Broadway to grab some beer for the party she and her husband were having. Her husband would wait until 6 p.m. the following day to call police. Less than a day later, on Monday afternoon, a woman's body was discovered in a field about 1.5 miles south of the Hatfield residence. Today, this section has been redone, but she was noted as being around here where the now no longer intersection of Topeka and East 36th South Street was. Frustratingly little is released about Christie's murder, but it was stated she died from a blow to the back of the head with an unknown object. It also took 4 days to identify her via dental records, despite their suspicions from the start it was Christie, meaning she likely had more facial trauma. Another murder with absolutely nothing released is the 1996 death of Anthea Williams, whose body was found October 30th in the basement of a now demolished abandoned apartment building in the north central neighborhood of the city. She was believed to have been left there for at least 2 months, and her cause of death was unknown, but believed to be homicide because someone had boarded up the apartment with her inside of it. So far, we have had 2 distinct methods of murder. Sherry Baker, Linda Casey, and Shannon Olsen were all tied up and then viciously stabbed and their throats slit. Barbara Smith, Gloria McCullough, Daisy Hamilton, Christa Martin, and Christy all died from a blow to the back of the head. For Anthea, we have no clue. Gloria, Daisy, Shannon, and Christy were all abducted after leaving their homes, while all the others would be attacked inside their homes, naturally drawing comparisons to BTK. But for the final similar unsolved murder, we need to take a look at a few other eerily similar crimes that had been mostly solved by the time Deanna Law would be found strangled in her bathtub in 1997. It was February 3, 1987, when coworkers of 60-year-old Ernestine Hoyst grew concerned she did not show up for work. After she didn't answer her door at apartment 1008 at the Amadon Apartments, 2 maintenance men opened the door for her supervisor. Inside, they found the partially nude body of Ernestine lying in an inch of water in her bathtub. Someone had sexually assaulted her, strangled her, and then ransacked the apartment. June 10th that year, 54-year-old Hattie Smith's husband would discover her body after returning home from work at their duplex at 3193 South Clinton. She'd been beaten, her hands and feet bound, and then strangled and her head pushed underwater in the bathtub until she died. The home had been ransacked, but police would not say if she had been assaulted or not. It was December 31st, 1987, when Mary Fager came home to find her husband, Kevin, dead of 2 gunshot wounds to the head in the entryway of their home. Downstairs, her 9 and 16-year-old daughters, Sherry and Kelly, had been placed in the running hot tub. Sherry had been bound with electrical tape, strangled to near death, and then thrown in to drown, while Kelly may or may not have been bound and died of unknown causes. Semen was found in the hot tub, and the family vehicle was missing, along with the handyman working on the home, William Butterworth. 3 days later, William would be arrested in Florida with the car and the Fagers' credit cards. He would be found not guilty in the crime because his semen did not match, nor did the fingerprints. While BTK would send a letter to the widow and police stating he was impressed with the crime, it is important to note he did not take credit and has been cleared in the attack. When another strangling occurred the next year, police instantly wondered if the cases were connected. It was September 30th, 1988, when 32-year-old Serena Patton came home from work. 3 hours later, when her boyfriend came over to find the drapes closed and Serena didn't answer, he phoned police. Her body would be found lying on the floor of her study, naked from the waist down. Her wrists and ankles showed signs of having been bound, but it is unclear if she had been sexually assaulted. Her head had also been dunked in the bathtub at some point during the attack, but the house had not been ransacked. The article also mentions a series of women had been sexually assaulted in their apartments in the southeast section of Wichita, where Patton and Hattie Smith lived. This time, however, a suspect would be found about 6 weeks later. Fingerprints found at the scene would match those of Anthony Kelly, a convicted burglar who had just been paroled 21 days earlier before the murder and later bragged about it. Anthony could not be the killer of the other women, as he was in jail. But in 1991, someone else would be convicted for multiple murders. On February 27, 1991, 85-year-old Isabel Moore would be found strangled on her apartment floor after being sexually assaulted and stabbed once in the chest. Again, it would only take a few months to link her murder to James Cromwell, a man who had begun staying at his friend's apartment just below Isabel's. DNA would link him to not only that murder, but to Elizabeth Hoyst's, who Cromwell had worked with before leaving Wichita in February 1987. Bizarrely, on November 12, 1991, while Cromwell was on trial, another death would occur in the exact same apartment as Ernestine Hoyst's murder, when Bruce Owens attempted to break inside apartment 1008, lived in by his ex-girlfriend, who would shoot and kill him in a justified homicide. 6 years later, on May 11, 1997, it happened again. After sexually assaulting, beating, and then strangling her to death, someone would place 53-year-old Deanna Law's body face down in her bathtub upstairs in her home at 1423 South Market. The night prior, Deanna was last seen leaving a local bar with a man, but 4 months later, her neighbor, Brian Kirkpatrick, would call police and confess to the crime. He would later recant his statement, saying OCD had led him to believe he was a suspect, but no one would take him seriously until he confessed. He did not match the sketch of the man from the bar. His hair nor semen would match what was found at the crime scene, and a jury would eventually find him innocent. In 2004, BTK would resurface until his capture a year later. Since that time, most of Wichita's unsolved murders are related to gang violence. In 2023, the 1989 murder of Christa Martin would be solved.
After 34 years, the Wichita family now has answers surrounding the death of Christa Martin. She was found beaten to death in her apartment in 1989.
After years of work, WPD and other partners say they know who killed her. KSN Samantha Boring explains how they got answers more than 3 decades later.
Julia, Jeff, in 1989, investigators collected DNA samples at the scene but never found a suspect. As advanced DNA technology became more available, Wichita police pushed to find answers. In 2020, WPD and other partners began using IgG, investigative genetic genealogy testing, to determine Paul Hart is the person who brutally murdered Christa Martin. As the years passed, Wichita police worked to determine the suspect.
We're not going to quit on these investigations, certainly not from 1989.
In 2020, WPD, the FBI, and other partners began reevaluating DNA evidence from the scene. They found a possible suspect who was no longer alive. They had to confirm his involvement.
They have to make sure that the person identified through these genealogical methods had access to the victim, could have been in the area, owned the type of weapon that might have been used.
This year, investigators collected family DNA linking Paul Hart to Martin's death. He died in a crash in 1999. Still, police presented their case to District Attorney Mark Bennett to review.
It was clear to me that this was a case that I would have charged if the suspect was alive to charge him.
The case is now considered cleared, helping Martin's family to find some closure.
I am glad we can finally move forward and have peace knowing that Christa's murderer is not walking around free or amongst us.
Who was Paul Hart? He would have been 23 years old at the time of Christa's murder, making him too young and out of place to commit the beating deaths earlier that decade. Are any of the men arrested involved in any more of the killings? Whether it was an unknown serial killer or a different person in each, for decades now, they have continued to roam the streets. Maybe in Wichita, maybe in another city. Until these cases are solved, we may never know just where the Wichita's secret serial killers roamed.